Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today I'd like to talk about ratios and proportions, a very, very important topic indeed. Now, ratios basically express part or portion of something. For example, you might have eaten half of an apple, or you might have traveled 1/3 of the distance to wherever you're traveling. So ratios express part or portion of something. Now, proportions are equivalent fractions. So proportions are equivalent fractions or ratios. For example, if you read one book in 2 days, how many books would you read in 4 days? Well, that's reasonably intuitive. You would have read 2 books in 4 days. So if you read 1 book in 2 days, you would have read 2 books in 4 days. For that matter, let's say you kept up with this amazing reading rate. How many books would you have read in 20 days? Well, you would have read 10 books, because that's half of 20. So these are equivalent fractions or equivalent ratios. Now, there are some basic rules that you have to follow when writing proportions. For example, if you wrote books in the number of days in the first ratio, the second ratio has to be also books in days, like this. You can't write the first ratio as books in days and the second ratio as in days over books. This would be incorrect. Or you can't write books over days in the first ratio and write pages over days in the second ratio. That would also be incorrect. Also, you can't write books over days in the first ratio and write books over months in the second ratio. That would be also wrong. Thus, the numerator and the denominator have to be consistent. Now, proportions are very helpful because you can use them to solve for something that you don't know based on something that you do know. For example, you read 1 book in 5 days. How many books would you read in 120 days? Well, you can set up a proportion like this. 1 book in 5 days. How many books in 120 days? Now I'm going to simplify this by writing 1 over 5 equals x over 120. Now the way we solve proportions like this is by cross multiplication. So cross multiplication means you take the numerator here and multiply with the denominator. So you get 1 times 120. And then you take the denominator of the first one and multiply with the numerator of the second one like this, 5 times x like that. 1 times 120 is just 120, and this is 5x. And then you can solve for x by dividing both sides by 5 like this. And when you do that, you get x equals to 24. You would read 24 books in 120 days at this pace. So you can see how you can use proportions to solve for something that you don't know based on something that you do know. Now, there are some basic properties of proportions that are very, very helpful to know. We shall go over these briefly. If you have a proportion like this, A over B equals C over D, we already talked about the fact that you can actually cross multiply these, such that A times D equals B times C or C times B like that. So this is called cross multiplication. Now, another thing that you can do with proportions is like this. If you have A over B equals C over D, then basically you can flip both sides. In other words, you can bring B up over here and A over here, and then you bring C down here and bring D over here. So basically, you're flipping both sides. This is the reciprocal property. RECIPROCAL, reciprocal property. So one of the things that you could do was to cross multiply. The second thing that you could do was the reciprocal property, that is, you can flip both sides. Now you have to flip both sides. You can't just flip one side. In other words, if 5 over 10 equals 10 over 20, then 10 over 5 equals 20 over 10. You're going to flip both sides. Now, a third thing that you can do, if you have a fraction like this, A over B equals C over D, then you can switch sides over here. It's kind of like A and D are best buddies and C and B are best buddies. It's like, okay, I want to take your place and you can take my place. So they can switch spots like this. Now, A and D can also switch spots, so you can get like D over B equals C over A. In this case, I moved the A over here and brought the D over there. One of the things that you can do that is legitimate with proportion is that you can switch these two, or alternatively you can switch those two. Now I call this the switching spots property. Now that's my affectionate term, of course, helps you understand that these two entities can switch between themselves. This can go over here and that can go over there. Now you can't switch both sides. You can, but then basically you're flipping the whole fraction. So if you switch both of them, basically you're using the reciprocal property. Now finally, this one is a little trickier, but very important. If you remember this, it'll come in handy from time to time. This one says if you have a proportion like this, A over B equals C over D, then you can take B and add it to the numerator, and to keep the proportion the same, you have to take D and add it to the numerator as well. Let me say that again. If you take B and add it to the numerator over here, you have to take D and add it to the numerator over here to keep the proportion the same. I call this the climbing denominators property, basically because I couldn't come up with anything better. But these are some important properties of proportions that are very important to remember. We talked about the cross multiplication property, that if you have proportions like this, you can cross multiply. We talked about the reciprocal property, and we talked about the switching spots property. In other words, you can take the denominator, switch with the numerator on the other side. You can take the denominator and switch to the numerator on the other side like this, one at a time. And finally, we talked about the climbing denominator property. You can take the denominator one and add it to the numerator, and to keep the proportion equivalent, you have to take the denominator on the other side and add it to the numerator like that. And these are some fundamental concepts. Being strong in fundamental concepts is very, very important. So I would request you to take time and understand these. Write them down and do whatever it takes for you to be very, very, very comfortable with them. It will help you out a lot. Until next time, As-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.